Good afternoon, wonderful people. I'm Markus Moos, and I'm teaching you today a first lecture that a bit of an adaptation from a first lecture I give to my first-year planning students in a course they all have to take. Planning administration doesn't exactly scream creativity in its title. As somebody suggested, I should change the title. But what I've tried to do instead is actually kind of get buy-in and interest from the students in this topic of planning administration. Planning, in this case, we're speaking about planning cities. Cities are growing fast. Most growth worldwide is happening in cities. The world is urbanizing. We want to learn more about how do we plan cities for livability, for sustainability. But one of the things that we need to learn more about is not just actually how do we plan cities physically, but how do we actually go about planning a city. So that's what administration is about. So today, the objective in these few minutes that we have is to actually define this topic of planning and administration. We also want to understand a bit about, when we leave here today, about the implications of different ways of administering planning. So let's get right into it, right? So here's the definition. Planning means the scientific, aesthetic, okay, I don't know. It's basically where stuff goes in our communities, right? So no disrespect to the Canadian Institute of Planners, but where stuff goes, where bridges go, where roads go, where community centers go, where stuff goes, right? Remember that. Planning is about where stuff goes in our communities. Administration, patterns of behavior and blah, 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 right? How do we carry out a task? And how do we organize ourselves to carry out that task? That's what administration is really about. So you put the two together and you kind of say, well, how do we carry out planning, right? How do we actually go about it? And so not only is it about, so today we're not so concerned about the stuff that we're going to plan in cities, but we're concerned about how do we decide where stuff goes in communities, how do we decide, emphasis on that, and importantly, who gets to decide where stuff goes in our communities, right? So that's about the administration of it. How do we carry out the act of planning cities? So to learn a bit more about what that might entail, I want to engage you today in an activity where we're going to decide what our neighborhood should look like. And you have a choice between A, B, C, and D, very creative neighborhood names, right? And what I'd like to do is if you're on this side of the room, so here I'm standing roughly in the middle, if you're on this side of the room, then the person who's at the table closest to me, so each table basically has to decide between A, B, C, and D, if you're the person on this side of the room closest to me, you're in charge. You pick for the group, A, B, C, or D. If you're on this side of the room, you're a very collaborative group. You have to work together at the table to figure out a consensus. Is it A, B, C, or D? Okay, let's do that. Okay, stop. Time is up. Time is up. Unfortunately, we are very efficient planning departments here. Time is already up. I would like to know which group on this side of the room made a decision. Oh, a couple of groups. Which groups on this side of the room made a decision? Everybody, right? So we just experienced, very quickly, I admit, we just experienced two different ways of carrying out planning, a more collaborative one and a more authoritarian one. Right? And we're not so concerned today about whether we picked A, B, C, or D. We can have that conversation later on. But we were more concerned about how we administered planning in this case. How do we carry it out? Was it more authoritative or was it more on consensus-based? And so then there are implications, right? How much time does it take? Some of you are very efficient, even on the consensus spectrum. But usually the amount of time when you do something by consensus is a little bit higher. When you have the authority to decide, yeah, my call, should be this way, it's often very quick. Degree of individual input, much lower in authority, right? Much higher when you work together in consensus. Difficulty making final decision. Who here may, already, admittedly, I didn't give you a lot of time, but certainly you had some difficulty over here. Let's admit it, right? These guys were better at making decisions because they could make them more efficiently. So lower difficulty when you make it by authority, but higher efficiency when you make it by consensus. But then importantly, you can also kind of measure relatively the resentment, right? Who over here felt like they didn't have a say in what neighborhood should look like? right? Most of you, except those who are sitting closest to me, right? Resentment high over here, resentment low over this way, right? So the implication of how we carry out planning are far widespread, but particularly concerned about whether people feel like they're involved in the decision that are being made about their communities. An example I can give you of that is, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, planners, who were often engineers at the time, but not to pick on Indian engineers, but often they were engineers. At the time, in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of freeways being built in the center of our major cities across North America. Those freeways often were built on what were existing communities, and there was a lot of concern about, in this case, the stopping of the Spadina Expressway in Toronto to save, quote-unquote, our city, because people felt like these large-scale projects were imposed on them by an authority without the community having an input about what the future of their neighborhood should look like. Today, I'm not suggesting that not all planning decisions are made collaborative, but certainly there has been a turn in planning towards more participatory and more collaborative engagement techniques. So that when you're planning a city, right, or you should engage the people that are most affected by the decision directly, or in this case, engage the pigeon, right? And so that you can hopefully lower that level of resentment in how people feel like decisions are being imposed upon them. Now, importantly, though, a couple of things you want to keep in mind is not every decision needs the same kind of administration, right? Some decisions, like if we're administering, how do we carry out a group project, let's say, if we want to decide whether the graph should have a green or a yellow line, maybe we make that decision by authorities. One person can make it quickly. But if we're going to decide something as important as the future of our community, maybe that should have a bit more consensus built into it. So not every decision requires the same level of administration, but how you choose to administer your planning has real implications for the people living in those places. Before we go, what are 3 things we learned in the last few minutes? We learned how to mumble and make cricket noises. Sorry? What is planning? So what is planning? Where stuff goes, right? One thing. What's the second thing? Yes? Different levels of administration for different kinds of decisions. Very good. A+ for that gentleman. Come again? We resent authority. All right. On that note, thank you very much.